this month, today, we continue the conversation. We started in August on the preamble to the Uniting Church Constitution, and we are led by the Rev Dr Garry Deverell and the Rev Dr Chris Budden. So Garry, great to see you again, and we invite you now to open our session with an acknowledgement of land and prayer. And by the way, I'm from the land of the Larrakia people, and greetings to all. Thank you, Garry.
Thanks, Catalina, and lovely to be with you again for this discussion. So I want to acknowledge that wherever we are on this continent, and even on some of the islands around the continent, this is Indigenous land, lands of Aboriginal nations, Torres Strait Islander nations. I'm coming to you today from Naarm or Melbourne, and this is the land of the Kulin nations, including the Wurundjeri or the Woiwurrung, where I am. I am a Tralloway man from northeast Lutruwita or Tasmania, and I'm very happy to be with you today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Garry. I am going to just introduce the team now today. So me, I'll start here. I'm Reverend Leah Miller. I'm a minister of the Word in the Uniting Church in Australia, currently living and serving on the lands of the Anga'aelangi people. And I'm just about to start properly at the Forest Kirk Uniting Church. I also host the Love, Rinse, Repeat podcast, where I interview theologians, ministers, artists, and activists, and it's often where you can find these conversations after the fact. And I've just started my become a PhD candidate through Charles Sturt University. Reverend Tawalafa Anga'aelangi is an ordained deacon in the Uniting Church, currently serving as tertiary chaplain at Charles Sturt University. As a theologian from Oceania, Lofa hopes to see more theological work from those at the grassroots of Pacifica. Lofa believes the church is accountable in creating space for truth-telling and active listening, and sees this webinar as a response and collaboration for bringing faith, justice, and academia together. Reverend Dr Katalina Tahaafe-Williams is an Oceanian womanist theologian. Catalina has served the world church and ecumenical movement as a leader in public and contextual theology, ecumenical missiology, interfaith relations, racial justice, and multicultural ministry. She holds degrees from the University of New South Wales, London, and Birmingham, UK, and is currently serving as social justice consultant for the Pilgrim Presbytery and minister at Nightcliff Uniting Church in the Northern Territory. And we are grateful to Reverend Dr Garry Deverell, who's returning, who's been on this panel a few times now that you might have seen. And this is a return after an important discussion that was started in August, focusing on the preamble to the Uniting Church in Australia's Constitution. Garry is Vice Chancellor's Fellow at the University of Divinity. And yeah, we've had him before, and his book, Gondwana Theology, is well worth picking up and checking out. We also welcome for the first time, Reverend Dr. Chris Budden. Hi, Chris. Chris is a quote-unquote retired minister in the Uniting Church in Australia and a former General Secretary of the New South Wales ACT Synod, who spent his last two placements working as a support person for the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress. He was chairperson of the working group that developed the preamble. Chris is also the author of Following Jesus in Invaded Space, Doing Theology on Aboriginal Land, 2009, and Why Indigenous Sovereignty Should Matter to Christians in 2018. He teaches Theology and Politics in Reconciliation at United Theological College and Living as a Christian on Aboriginal Land at Broken Bay Institute. He is an adjunct faculty member at UTC and associate researcher at Charles Sturt University. And later on, we might hear a little about one of those courses from Chris, which would be interesting to, because I know it's happening again soon. So for now, I'm going to hand over to Catalina to moderate this next little bit, but welcome to everyone. And folks watching at home, welcome to you all too.
Thank you so much, Liam. Thank you again to Chris and to Garry for your willingness to lead our conversation on the preamble to the UCA Constitution Part 2. Part 1, as Liam says, we began in August, and in that conversation, Garry expressed some concerns about the preamble, which then led us to reconnecting with Chris and leading us to this moment where the two of them are here to lead the conversation. And I'm going to be moderating the dialogue between Chris and Garry. And what I am going to do is to ask Garry first to reiterate his concerns again that he shared with us in August. And then after Garry has spoken, then I will ask Chris to respond. And I'm going to ask Chris to respond in two parts. The first part is to give a very brief and precise account of how the preamble came about and how it was developed. And then secondly, to give his considered response directly to Garry's concerns. So I'll be moderating in that way until I feel it's ready. We're ready then to turn over and include our panelists and others who are joining in the conversation. So without further ado, could I please invite you, Garry, to articulate and reiterate your concerns about the preamble?
Thank you, Catalina. I'll try. Part of this exercise will be remembering what I said last time. I think my primary concern is that although it's very, very clear that those who put the preamble together are doing so out of a genuine intention to be inclusive of the perspectives and the experience of Indigenous people, and certainly to acknowledge the damage that has been done to Indigenous people through the process of colonisation and fess up to that. I feel that the preamble only goes some way towards addressing the full extent of what colonisation does and colonisation means. So for me, the preamble, although it intends to decolonise perspectives in the church, actually succeeds only in doing the opposite, because it still assumes that the Christian view of the world is, ontologically, metaphysically, the view of the world which explains all things. And therefore, it says, for example, in paragraph 1 of the preamble, when the churches that formed the Uniting Church arrived in Australia as part of the process of colonisation, they entered a land that had been created and sustained by the triune God they knew in Jesus Christ. That had been created and sustained by the triune God they knew in Jesus Christ. Now, so the first line in the preamble, which is supposed to be inclusive and a decolonising act, reiterates that the colonists' view of God is the correct view of God. So the colonists' view of God as a triune God known in Jesus Christ is the God, the correct view of the divine, if you like. Then in the second paragraph, it goes on to say that Aboriginal and Islander peoples or First Peoples continue to see themselves as traditional owners and custodians, sovereign, since time immemorial. Now that phrase, time immemorial, is actually a phrase that comes from legal discourse in this country. It's not actually, it doesn't actually come out of theological discourse or out of Aboriginal or Islander discourse. It comes out of legal discourse, and it basically means since before we had records. So it kind of writes a kind of a legal perspective onto what's going on in that second paragraph. It also says some theological things. It says that through this land, God, that is the God identified in paragraph 1, the triune God, the God known in Jesus Christ, is the one who sustained First Peoples in this country. So again, if you read that through a decolonising lens, what I would say is that it's proposing that the colonists were right about God, and that if any God was active in this land, it was the God that colonists know through their European religion, their European perspective. Then in the third paragraph, which is, I think, the most problematic paragraph myself, there's the claim that First Peoples had already encountered the Creator God before the arrival of the colonisers. Now, who is this Creator God? Go back to paragraph 1, the triune God known in Jesus Christ. So it claims that we had already encountered that God. We, that is Aboriginal and Islander people, had already encountered that God before the arrival of the colonisers. Now, that's a really, really big claim. It's a really, really big claim that I think is very difficult to sustain. Now, I know that there are Aboriginal people around, many of them who were brought up in a mission situation, or their parents were brought up in a mission situation and they are still in the church, who were taught that. And so that is what they believe. But I think increasingly, from the perspective of the project of decolonisation, which has gathered apace in the last 20 years or so, and particularly in the last 10 years since this preamble was written, I think that looks like an increasingly problematic claim. It goes on to say the Spirit was already in the land revealing God to the people, that is the triune God known in Jesus Christ, to the people through law, custom and ceremony. Now, again, it's a big claim. I'm not sure how you can sustain that. Everything I know about Indigenous knowledges, including the knowledges that come through my own country and the elders that interpret that country, would not use any of this sort of language at all. Would not talk in this way whatsoever. The same love and grace that was finally and fully revealed in Jesus Christ, finally and fully revealed in Jesus Christ, sustained the first peoples and gave them particular insights into God's way. So what it's saying is, as far as I can see, and Chris may correct me later if I'm misreading this, but what it seems to me to be saying is that although Aboriginal religion or spirituality, custom, ceremony, ritual, however you want to talk about it, law, looks very, very different to European religion with its talk about a triune God and, the revelation in Jesus Christ and so on, that actually underneath it all, they're the same. So there's a claim that there's some sort of deep ontological or metaphysical structure here, and that while there may be differences on the surface, they're just appearances, they appear different, but underneath they're the same, and the language of the triune God and the revelation in Jesus Christ is more accurate, is ontologically more accurate. So that the Aboriginal expressions of spirituality and the meaning of the land and the relationship in relationships in community, etc., are in fact secondary expressions of that deeper underlying thing, which is actually the triune God, the revelation in Jesus Christ, which has come from Europe. Now, from where I stand, that's an act of imaginative colonisation, because it posits that the European version of reality, of theological reality, of ontological reality, is primary, and that the spirituality of Aboriginal people has to be absorbed into that in order to come to its fullness. It has to be reinterpreted within this larger framework, which is Christian theological language, in order to reach its zenith or its fullness of being and of expression. And that, my friends, is what colonisation is.
Mm.
Colonisation is the absorbing of smaller cultures and languages and communities, less powerful languages and cultures, into a larger one because of a view that the larger one is actually the right one. That is what colonisation is. And so from my point of view, particularly paragraph 3, but also the paragraphs that go before it, do that, and therefore it's an act of colonial imagination. Now, the rest of what's said, I'm not too unhappy with, because it actually just goes to the question of whether justice is ever going to happen in this country. And the Uniting Church in this preamble expressed it as a desire that it would happen. But it don't, and obviously there's a lot of things in here that are aspirational, and that's fine. But the other thing I guess I'd want to point to, and it's probably worth discussing somehow, is that there's a kind of what I would call a sort of ecclesiastical Darwinism built into this whole project, it seems to me. The Uniting Churches with a small u and a small c are seen as having done the wrong thing. But the Uniting Church with a capital U, because it's now entered into a covenant with the UAICC, is doing the right thing. And therefore justice is now possible. And we look for a day at the end, paragraph 9 and 10, we look for a day when we can share a destiny together, praying and working together for a full expression of our reconciliation in Jesus Christ. Okay, so the mark of our reconciliation is when we will all be together in the cultural linguistic framework of the colonizer. Okay, and that is seen as the end point somehow. Now, Aboriginal sense of time is obviously problematised by this, and I've said all those kinds of things before. I think a little bit more work needs to be done on how eschatology and Aboriginal notions of time might actually talk to each other in a way where one doesn't absorb the other. But, the details of that I kind of went into last time. So I think that's it. I think I'll just leave it at that for now. Hopefully that's reminded a few people of what I said last time, and as just kind of opened up a few directions that our conversation can take from for here on in. Thank you very much, Catalina.
Thank you so much, Garry. Thank you. Now, Chris, could you give us first a brief outline of how the preamble was developed before you give your direct response to Garry, please?
Catalina, I think the two things are intertwined.
Okay, absolutely.
Because I think I need first of all to pay my respects to the Awabakal people on whose land I live, and to Garry, and to any other Aboriginal people who may be listening to this. My interest in this, of course, has already been declared. I was the convener of the working group. But I also want to say that as a second person, it's not my task to dispute whether or not this is a colonial reading, because that in itself would be an interesting colonial exercise, telling an Indigenous person that they'd misread the colonial intentions of the document. But I think it's really important to understand that the preamble is in fact not an abstract theological struggle. It's an engaged struggle by a group of people to create a document that is about their engagement in the life of the Uniting Church. So it was set in place by a group of Indigenous Christian people who were wrestling with the way in which they were both Indigenous and Christian, and the nature of their belonging in the life of the Uniting Church. The context, in a sense, was the three questions of the nature of the relationship between first and second peoples in the church, and how first peoples get priority in that relationship. It was about the very nature of self-determination in the life of the church. You see, the preamble was one of a number of proposals that were brought to the 2009 Assembly that spoke about the relationship between Congress and the Indigenous people who belong to Congress and the church. So it's one part of that ongoing struggle. And the third part of it was, how could people claim to be followers of Jesus and not keep being told that they had to leave their culture at the door? So how could they actually affirm the things that they believed? So I think it's important to understand the nature of the document, that the very first draft of the document, which has been changed and altered in ways that Garry highlighted. I mean, the original document didn't talk about Jesus at all. The original document was nor the Trinity, I should add. Part of the negotiation, I think, is understanding that in negotiating this, if it has a post-colonial dimension to the preamble's dimension, is that it destabilizes meanings. That in a sense, in classical post-colonial theory, it uses stuff to destabilize stuff. And it may have then drifted over to where Garry says, and it may not have succeeded in that at all. It may have remained more colonial than post-colonial. But from the point of view of those who are engaged in it, who were trying to find a better space in the life of the church, what they were trying to do was to destabilize the meaning of the church's language about God and knowledge of God in a way that would enable them to live in that space and do theology differently as members of the church. So they weren't attempting even to read their tradition in a pure way. They recognized they were reading it as Christians. There is no pure reading of tradition. There's no sort of set in the past reading. We all reread, and they were reading out of that kind of space. I think one of the good illustrations of that, of what was going on, was Garry last time talked about language and the probability that we would be better off with a kind of poetics in this kind of language space. And I think that's probably right. I think that kind of language would have been more important. But the reason for the language, and language is, again, choice of language and is always contextual, and the choice of the nature of the language had to do with the very first reason why this happened. And that was that in the middle of a debate about whether Congress had been disrespected by the 2003 Assembly in the debate about sexuality, Congress threatened to leave the Uniting Church, and after a series of conversations, there was a renewal of the covenant conversation. And in the middle of the renewal of the covenant conversation, Congress came back to the church and said, we believe that it's important to put something in the law of the church. We're fed up with you people writing stuff down, putting in your briefcases and walking away, or somebody finds loose language, and poetic language for church people is often loose language, that somebody will misuse, and in a year or two's time, it'll say something that we didn't want to. So that the shape of the language, which probably overstates what you would often do theologically and in these dialogues, is language that people wanted to use to make sure that people didn't fudge the future conversations. So it's that sense of how deeply contextual I think that it is that's important to understanding this conversation, and also important to deciding how you judge what I think are fair comments from Garry about the nature of this as a colonial document. That is, particularly in Garry's comment last time that he thinks it probably ought to be taken out and thrown away. And people's response at the time, which was, well, maybe we ought to get on board with that conversation. Because I want to finish by saying to people that I think my request is simple. Before engaging in a conversation about whether the preamble should be removed or is irretrievably colonial, it's really important to talk to the first people in the Uniting Church who both put the preamble together, who provided the very first foundations and 3 years of constant conversation that went into law groups in the Northern Synod with some of the finest Indigenous theological minds in that part of the world, and more closely traditional minds in that part of the world, that we need to at least recognise that, and recognise that for a whole lot of people, this has been an eye-opener in terms of their capacity to wrestle with both sides of their own life. Gary's right, they're mission people. They're people who carry that tradition and that reading, but they do, and they do belong to the church. And I hope that people who are involved in this seminar will understand that before we get into any other conversation, people need to sit down with that group of people. And I know Gary's sharing a table with somebody fairly soon who would sit in that space and have that conversation. Why did people know that they were entering into? Sorry, let me just make a point. There was a point about 6 or 8 months before the preamble was approved, where there were significant changes that Gary's pointed to. The use of the language of Trinity and the use of Jesus, which are both markers of Christian faith. And there was a sense in which at that point the preamble shifted from being an attempt by Indigenous people to put something unilaterally in a preamble to a negotiated kind of settlement, if you like, to a negotiated space where they had to work out whether they could gain enough in the conversation, dismantle and disturb enough of the church's position to make it worthwhile staying in the conversation. They chose to stay in the conversation despite the risks that Gary's really highlighted quite well. And my only comment is that you've got to have those conversations before it goes into any other space. So that's my offering for today. I'm grateful for Gary's comments. I'm doing some postgraduate work on the preamble, and he keeps disturbing me enormously as I do this work, for which I'm grateful if I don't beat him up sometime. But thank you. It's been very helpful.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Chris. I'm going to go back to Garry, see if he has any other responses he wants to make.
I think hearing Chris's comments around the context and the conversations is, I think, really, really helpful. And I would want to affirm what Chris has said about that, and the need to talk to the people who were involved in putting it all together as a key part of any process of, reformation or revision, if you like. I'm as prone as the next person to hyperbole when it comes to saying things like, we should just remove it and throw it away, that kind of thing. So let's recognise that for hyperbole. It does seem to me that around the time these conversations were happening, I had a strong feeling that the full diversity of the Congress was not really deployed towards that conversation. I feel like people like myself who didn't grow up in a mission situation, and who had a little more Western education, and perhaps lived in the urban parts of the country, and some of us like that, we weren't really even aware that the conversation was happening. We weren't really invited to the table, which is a bit of a shame, I thought, because I think there are some helpful perspectives that we might have offered to that. So I recognise that you can't talk to everyone. That's just absurd, obviously. But I guess my lament would be that perhaps some of the emerging younger kind of individuals who have in fact probably since actually left the church, weren't really engaged at the time. And, you know, I recognise that it's difficult to do that. But I was one of the more obvious ones, I would have thought. You know, I was ordained, I had a PhD, I was publicly engaged in theological conversations within the Congress, within the theological forums that were starting up just before that time, and things like that. And there were others as well that I felt perhaps you know, could have been consulted a bit more. So I guess my sense is that there was a dominant culture in the UAICC, and the dominant culture was consulted, you know. But we should never make the mistake that all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people agree with each other. We're as diverse as anyone else. And you know, I just think that it's important to sort of, because occasionally the prophet is in the minority, you know. Sometimes the prophet is the lone voice, and it's worth having a talk to the lone voice from time to time. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to agree with them, but I think engaging them in the conversation can be quite helpful.
Yeah.
So I think that's really all I have to say there. I think it's also worth noting that I'm offering these comments now into the conversation by invitation. I don't actually have a right to speak into this conversation by virtue of being a member of the Uniting Church or a member of the UAICC anymore, you know. So I don't have a right by virtue of those memberships to contribute to this conversation. I'm doing so by invitation. So in a sense, it's not really my conversation to have. I recognise that it's a conversation that the Uniting Church has to have, including the UAICC. So my comments need to be taken in that context as well.
Thank you so much, Garry. I'm just keeping my eye on the time, and it looks like we're now at that point where we can open up the conversation to the wider panelists and also to folks who have zoomed in. And I want to encourage anybody with any comments or questions to please don't be afraid to put it through to us. And of course, for Garry and Chris, feel free to, you know, to join in and say anything that you need to say, because it's very important for us in this webinar to hear from the two of you in this even in this wider conversation. So can I go to Lofa and Liam to see if they have anything to say, and if any one of us knows of any comments that's come through, because I haven't seen it myself, feel free to let us know, please.
Lofa, do you have something you want to go first with?
Thank you, Garry and Chris. I guess my question is, I guess the question is for everybody. Who do you think has benefited from this document of the preamble in the church? Who has benefited the most from it?
Good question.
That's my question. And I'm still trying to gather my head around all the information that you've given today, which is just remarkable. So thank you both.
Is there a question for you, Chris?
Look, from where I sit over the last few years, I think there are two answers to that. The first is that there are a number of people who are part of Congress who have found this quite a permission-giving document, if you like. People who are committed to the church and who've found some space in it to start thinking about their own traditions much more deeply. And there have been a number of conversations over the last few years where that's been right. And I know at the moment there's some people starting to think about how do you have a conversation now about Jesus, for example, and the very nature of Jesus, if you start to own your own traditions. And that's why it's important, I think, that people like Garry are around somehow around the sides of those conversations or in the middle of them, because I think the Uniting Church has not been as good at these conversations as, for example, parts of the Baptist Church or even the Catholic Church. There's been a kind of slowness in getting into the formal theological conversations in Congress. And I think this starts to open that up a bit. I think when the church finally takes the preamble seriously, even in its present form, there's enough in it to terribly destabilize the kind of European, Eurocentric understanding of theology. When you put a statement in there that says that basically other people understand God, even if we have the debate about whether that's the same God or different, it actually does break open, I think, the possibility that the church, and I think for Pacific Islanders and Koreans and other people who are not Europeans, this has actually also created some space for people to say, maybe we can figure out how our tradition and understanding of God enters into a dialogue with our Christian faith better than it has. And I mean, there's been a massive development in Oceania theological conversations over the last while. And I think in the Uniting Church, there's some of that potential. So there's really three answers. I mean, for Indigenous people, it's one. For other people, it's another. And I think for the whole church, there's a deep challenge in the preamble to the way in which we've understood, particularly God's relationship to creation, and thus the very meaning of salvation. But we haven't unpacked it. I think we're simply refusing to unpack it. But it is a deeply challenging understanding.
Thank you, Chris. That's very helpful. Liam, did you have anything that you want to ask or comment on?
There's so much. I think it's been a very rich conversation. One thing I was curious of is, so it's very interesting to talk about here at the drafting process, and particularly the level of, I guess, compromise that had to occur, right? That conversation of, okay, do we stick with how we really want this, or do we make those changes, particularly around the language around Trinity and Jesus? And part of me is curious, first of all, if there's within Uniting Church archives and documentary history, whether the earlier drafts exist in a way that is accessible, because I think there could be some very good work done in looking at the two, and particularly looking at, okay, almost, in sense of thinking about, decolonizing, what were the moves that sought to, I guess, box in or shape that, and what was the, established church trying to maneuver, right? By the way, looking at the documents together, I think some really interesting work could be done. So I guess part of it is, a bit about, does that exist in a way that can be found? And I guess, I'll start with that. There's some other stuff I'm thinking about too.
Liam, I'm actually writing that chapter at the moment.
Okay.
I have all those documents sitting behind me, each one of the drafts, each one of the progressions, and a sense of trying to figure out, I mean, what happened in the drafting was the Congress came forward with a draft. There was an assembly committee working on constitutional change, and its task was narrowed to pick up the draft that came and to work through the whole question of a new preamble. So that was developed further in conversation with the Congress National Executive, and then was sent out to the church for conversation. And then there was all sorts of conversation came back, and criticism. And the criticism came back both about the theology, and of course there was a terrible lot of kickback about the idea that, one, that you'd put Aboriginal people at the forefront of the conversation anyway, two, that you would make confession about things and didn't say that missionaries are all fabulous people. So there was kind of a multitude of conversations going on at the same time, and some real kickback from a couple of synods about why don't we have the two markers of, what we acknowledge to be Christian, the Trinity and Jesus, in much more stronger language. I think the Congress, to be fair, probably did let the Trinity stuff go, because they just let that go, because early on the language was in paragraph 1 was created was land that had been created by the Creator God. There was no mention of Trinity right up until about March, I think, 2009. So very close. And the Jesus thing, it's a statement that kind of church people, including Indigenous church people, look at it and go, "Oh, that's about Jesus. We believe in Jesus. Yeah, we can stick that in," because people have multiple readings. It's in there, but do we mean what they mean? So it seems to me that people let it go in because what it meant to them was not what it meant to those who wanted it in there. But of course, when it's in there, it's then you're into a different kind of wrestle. So yeah, it's because it went back and forth as well, because you had a development, and then the legal reference committee got engaged. They came up with a whole different plot. And then the general secretaries got engaged, and this is where the colonial stuff gets interesting, because they obviously had an agenda, and it got all messy and got negotiated and sorted through. And I mean, Congress signed off on it the week before the assembly.
So I mean, I suspect, well, from what I'm hearing, Chris, and to Garry as well, the Aboriginal folks that were involved in the drafting of the preamble may have been hemmed in at two levels. One, but by their own compromised position as Christians, because if we're reading this from a colonial, post-colonial lens, then I would say the same for myself as a Pacific Island Christian. It's very hard to do, to step back and look at it from a purely colonial, post-colonial lens when I am also a Christian. But so they were hemmed in by that, but also hemmed in by what Liam calls the established church, and the theologians and the dominant church voice that were wanting things to be drafted in a particular way, with the theology and all of that. So in that sense, that they were in a very, very difficult position, weren't they? And then so that's one thing that I want to say, and hopefully Chris can respond to that, and maybe even Garry. But the other thing is, then if you're writing something, Chris, is it then not possible for you to say at this point in the evolution of the preamble, if I can use that word, that it is time to have to relook at it? There's space to have another look at the preamble and have a conversation in the way that Garry would propose.
Let me start with that one rather than the other. The question is whether the preamble is the right space to have the conversations that Garry talks about, because there's such important theological conversations, and the preamble is such a difficult space to have them in. And it had them in the first place because people were deeply committed to having something in the law of the church. They were just sick and tired of people not respecting stuff. I mean, it really was a conversation about how do people have a genuinely hybrid identity? How do people both claim their traditions and the Christian story, knowing that the reading of their own story is I don't know whether I want to use the word compromise, but it's certainly impacted by the fact that they've committed to another story. So they can't read their story anymore. Nobody can actually read the ancient story anymore the same way because people live inside another framework. It's a bit like the early church when it adopted Greek philosophy as the reading platform for the Christian story. It so changed the story. Well, when Aboriginal people, when they read backwards, and Garry's right, when you read backwards into your own story, yeah, but I think what people were trying to do was build a hybrid identity. And so it wasn't this or that. It was a how do I live with both the things I'm committed to, with some integrity, and the judgment for them to make, and people like Garry to make, and not me, is whether they've compromised one or the other of them too badly in the hybridity, you know.
Yeah. Garry, do you have anything to say to that?
You're on mute, mate.
Oh, am I on mute or is it
No,
Garry?
Sorry, you know, we've been doing this for 2 years and I still haven't got my act together on it. Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, to the general point of hybridity and the fact that you can only begin in the middle of what's happened rather than, you know, from a sort of privileged, pure point of view from, you know, any perspective, actually, that's true. And so people begin to interpret their own history and to interpret their own aspirations in the middle of the story that they're already enrolled in from the moment they're born, you know. And for Indigenous people in this country, we are enrolled in a colonial story from the moment that we're born, which means that that the power relations are fundamentally unequal from day one and continue to be unequal from that point onwards. And, you know, what I think everyone needs to understand about Indigenous people is that because we are a colonised people, we cannot step outside of colonial practices, colonial language, in order to see, as it were, from a God's eye point of view, or even from a sort of pre-invasion, you know, so-called pure Indigenous point of view, what is actually the truth, you know. We can only come at the truth from the point of view of people who are colonised, you know. And so that means that the unpicking that needs to happen is painstaking work. And not many of us are actually terribly up to it. Not many of us have the luxury to be able to give sustained thought to this, because we're just fighting to survive, to stay alive in this country, you know. So so that's the reality. That's the reality, and it's important that people understand that. What that means, I think, in terms of documents like the preamble, is that you know, most Aboriginal Christians, people who identify as Christians, will read this stuff and they won't have any idea what it's about. No, you know, no idea what it's about. We'll see it as basically a white document.
Are you frozen, Garry? Is anybody experiencing some technological problem
I
like
think it's just at Garry's end. I think he's frozen.
Oh, okay.
Do we want to?
Yeah, well, Lofa said that there was a question. Lofa?
Great.
Yeah, there's a question there from Robin Whitaker. So she said, thank you for the rich conversation. I share some of Garry's concerns, although wouldn't have framed them in the same way. And this is not a criticism. I'd be interested to hear the panel reflect on what aspects of interreligious dialogue might be relevant for this conversation. And it strikes me that we've seen a shift in interreligious dialogue from claiming we all worship the same God with different names to recognizing and respecting difference so that we might learn from one another. How might that apply here?
That's a great, thank you very much, Robin. That's really true. You know, we need to look at that. What do you think, you guys? all of you, anybody.
Can I say that I just think that's been part of my struggle with Garry's conversation, is that I think it sounded like he was talking about interreligious dialogue. But this is not at one level interreligious dialogue. This is people not arguing about whether Christianity and traditional religious life sit where they sit. It's people who sit in both of them. And that shifts, that makes a difference, I think, to the conversation. It's not an abstract conversation about two parallel conversations, or even two parallel understandings of God, or even if you can call God in one space. It's how do people who sit in one space and who've decided to enter another space still talk about both those spaces? I
think one of the things maybe where it's tricky is, I think, because I think you're right, there's a sense that you could see this, okay, this is a Christian interpretation of culture, right, and of story and this. I think maybe part of the problem it runs into is the document itself feels very universal.
Yeah,
right? Like it's making claims about it feels like it's making claims about the whole of the pre-colonial history, story, culture. Where, as you say, it's more about, okay, how does a particular group within a church understand it and bring it into dialogue, which is interesting there. I think that's what, so you could read it and go, oh wow, the Uniting Church are making all these kind of colonial assimilationist, claims about the whole thing from the document's face value, but through you're saying, I guess, about the process, this is actually a specific group of people who are making this, and whether it's the problem is that the language doesn't kind of necessarily reflect that, I think is where it's a kind of an interesting, the wrinkle emerges. That is this a claim about the nature of reality? And then which I think a lot of Gary's points, there straight away, or is this a thing about a kind of a personal witness of that kind of hybrid journey of a lived religiosity of how this, these fit together for a group, and how that informs the life of the church, or should hopefully inform the life of the church. So I think, and I think maybe that, just to kind of pick with Robin's point a little bit, and something I was thinking about is, I think that's something Christianity is like an inherent struggle within Christianity, and particularly with Christianity's relationship to Judaism, where, at the worst it's saying, cool, we see your tradition and we can tell you where the final fulfilled location of its meaning is in Jesus Christ. And Jews would say, no, that's not how you interpret this religion. That's not correct. But there's a difference to saying, well, with it, my religiosity, there's, my lived religion, my experience brings me to this sense that these texts have some relationship to Jesus, the Messiah. And I think that's two very different conversations in how we think about interreligious dialogue, Judaism, and personal experience of how these things fit together. And I wonder if there's something of a dichotomy here, and maybe we learn from how we think about those things as distinct conversations in this kind of context too.
Liam, I think one of the challenges of the preamble, which we don't often see, is that in fact, in some ways challenges the universalizing claim about Jesus the Messiah. Because it's really interesting. I mean, although it picks up words late, about revealed in finally and fully revealed in Jesus, the little dig at the end of it is, and gave them particular insights. There's a kind of shifting, and there's a shifting when you go into creation and place so much emphasis on creation and land and relatedness that it seems to me undermines a whole lot of the assumptions around Christian faith and universality and all that stuff potentially in there, I think.
Gary's back with us.
Yeah, sorry folks. For some reason, the power went out, and for 30 seconds or something, and And I had a bit of a scramble to get back online, so apologies for that.
Just for Gary, we're looking at Robin Whitaker asked a question in the Q&A, which I think you can see as a panelist. So that's what we're kind of discussing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting point that she made. So maybe you can finish what you were saying before and then move on to what Robin Whitaker said. Garry?
Well, that's a challenge. Can I remember what I was saying before? Look, I think that I was then going to say that I guess most of the Uniting Church people that I know personally would be at the sort of theologically liberal end of the Uniting Church, if you want to use that sort of perspective. And I'm not sure that they've got the right message from the preamble, the message that was intended from the preamble. A lot of those people who are kind of theologically liberal, to the point where I would say they are possibly sort of, all religions point to the same God kind of people. What they seem to have got from the preamble is that Indigenous religion and Christian religion are pretty much the same thing. So it doesn't really matter what the differences are. And we don't actually have to spend sustained time contemplating any particular tradition and what that means in its own terms, because, always lead to Rome being God or the divine or something in some way. And so I often have people, ask me questions out of an assumption that what the preamble is doing is saying that all religions are the same. To which I have to respond, well, I'm not sure that's what's actually going on either in the preamble or indeed in the religions or the religious traditions that are being referenced in the preamble in brackets in a fairly unequal way in my view, but nevertheless are there. So now I can't tell you whether the preamble has had another effect in other parts of the Uniting Church, because I actually don't know anyone who comes from that sort of end of the church. So my experience is very limited. So that was all. That was in response to that sort of question about how the preamble has helped or hindered or opened things up or not for people in the church.
Did you see the question from Robin about interfaith and interreligious relations and dialogue, and how we might be able to see this conversation from that perspective?
I didn't, but I can certainly have a go at the interreligious dialogue thing.
It's in the chat, Garry, if you want to open the chat.
Yeah, I've opened the chat, but I don't see it.
It's the last one in the chat.
Okay, I think the chat's been reset by the fact that I came
the power went off.
Came in late. I don't know why that
touches a bit. It touches a bit on what you were just saying. That that is definitely what you're saying. The all roads lead to God. The one mountain, and I want to get up into the fog. It's all the same. Is kind of becoming moved out of the interreligious conversation sphere, and it's more recognizing and respecting difference and how we might learn from one another without flattening tradition. So it definitely just ties into a lot of what you're saying, and I guess how thinking of the discussion more in that kind of a framework might actually help what we're doing.
Yeah. I mean, the thing is that all, every religious tradition has its own theology of religions. So it's not like we all share a kind of metaphysical common story out of which we then enter into theological dialogue about the specifics of any particular tradition. Whether we're conscious of it or not, everyone engages in interreligious dialogue from a set of theological assumptions about what theological dialogue is, and so that's part of the difficulty of what we do. At a practical level, to invoke a sort of pragmatics, which some people might be surprised to hear from me. But, at the level of pragmatics, it seems to me that what is at least required in any kind of interreligious dialogue or intertraditional dialogue is a sort of what I would call a deep listening. And deep listening. Deep listening is the kind of listening that you can only get to if you've been in a conversation for some time, I think, because you have to kind of tune in to the cadences of the language and the context, and if you like, the sort of heart that is there in the conversation. And I think it takes a while to get there. The metaphor that I would use is that of marriage, actually. When people fall in love, there's all sorts of assumptions about what the other person means and what they're saying, but it's all filtered through this kind of great feeling that you have, right? And so you tend to interpret everything through that sort of experience. But when time goes on and the hormones stop pumping quite so much, and so the feeling level starts to kind of plateau out a bit more, you actually start to hear what the other person's saying in its genuine otherness, and that maybe they didn't mean what you thought they meant by whatever they said, and so on. And so you actually have to start dealing with the reality of the other person rather than one's version of that other person. And it seems to me that any kind of interreligious dialogue has to follow that similar path. And it takes a while to get there. You can't, I often say to groups of essentially, white people who ask me to go and talk to their church or whatever, you're not going to be able to hear what Aboriginal people are saying about what's important to us in an hour. You're just not going to be able to hear it, because everything that you hear will be filtered through a whole heap of assumptions about what Indigenous people are on about. And therefore, those assumptions will get in the way, and you will reread everything that I say or that another person says through that set of assumptions. And you'll go away with a sort of warm feeling about having engaged in sort of dialogue with Aboriginal people, and there's brownie points in that for you. So I guess what I'm calling for in this sort of space is a deeper conversation that you can only get to by continuing to return to the campfire, to use that metaphor that I've used a few times before, to return to the campfire, to sit around it and to really listen. And as I've said before, it's incumbent upon the people who have the most power, just by virtue of their membership in the sort of colonial culture, to do the most work in that, to do the most listening, because their voices are already heard all the time. They're heard in government, they're heard in church, they're heard, in advertising, on the radio, on the television. Their voices are ubiquitous, but the voices of Indigenous people are not. And there's it's not just a danger, but it's almost a certainty that because of that, those who belong to the dominant culture will always be interpreting what Indigenous people say in their own terms. And so the only way to get beyond that is to have a sustained conversation and to commit oneself from both sides to a sustained conversation. Now, I've got to tell you, that's really, really costly from the Indigenous side. Really, really costly. Yeah. To the point of sometimes making us sick. Yeah. Because it seems to take a long, long time for people from the dominant culture to even start to understand and really hear what we're saying. And it's actually quite heartbreaking. to get, 3 years into a conversation and to realize that even the most basic stuff has not really filtered through yet. It's really, really heartbreaking. I was saying to someone the other day, my ministry supervisor, actually, I was saying, look, I feel like every day I get up in the morning and I have to prepare myself to be misunderstood. That's a terrible thing to have to do every single day. But it's what I do. It's what I have to do every day. And it's what every Indigenous person has to do every day. Just by virtue of the power relations which are already in place and into which we're all born and inducted from day one. So anyway, that's Garry's pragmatics of inter-religious dialogue, for what it's worth.
Thank you, Garry. As we've come to the end of our time together, and so this is a time I invite our panelists to share their final comments. So might start with you, Catalina, and Liam, then myself.
Yeah, and Chris, of course. Oh, am I on? Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. So, I guess when I hear you, Garry, saying, that you wake up every morning preparing to be misunderstood, I have to say that is an experience that people who are not of the dominant culture, and especially if English is not your first language, that is an experience that that people like that resonate with. But that's not to diminish. I absolutely agree with what you say, and it's important that we all recognize that every Aboriginal person live with that reality on a daily basis. What I want to say as as a final comment is that I really think that it would be important to continue this conversation. So in some way, we need to find a way to continue this conversation, keeping in mind Chris's portion about having a conversation with the people who drafted the preamble. So that's all I want to say. But thank you to Chris and to Garry.
Yeah, thank you both. I think it is like, it's amazing to think of how much has changed since 2009, right? And the way these conversations are happening, and conversations around race and the ongoing colonial violence and all that. Like, I think obviously not new conversations, but like the way they've come to the zeitgeist, the way they've been engaged, hitting with generational change and other things, like, and it's that thing of as we then think about these ongoing conversations, is that like, where do they happen and in what form? Because to put something into a preamble of a constitution takes, as we saw, years, and then you get there and it's not in the way maybe everyone wanted it, but and then everyone's tired, and so the prospect of going again is so wearying. But and also there can be this fear, this temptation to think like, good, it's in an official document, so it's done now. But as we said, like it's this ongoing disturbance, this ongoing reorientation, repentance, new learning that has to happen in prolonged relationships. So I think as we continue to think about all that's been raised and what this calls on the church to do, it's seeing it as a whole of church, ongoing, uncontainable path and process. And so I think thinking of form and where it takes us is very important, because it needs to disrupt and disturb ongoingly. And because who knows how these conversations, if whatever we put into pen now or put on ink now, like what will we be looking at in 2030 and thinking of, how that's changed, how the context has changed and shifted again. So I think that's just really helpful for us to be thinking that this has to be ongoing, and we can't think that we settle it at any point. So yeah, that's the thought.
Thanks, Garry and Chris, for such a rich conversation. It's interesting when we talk about this on keeping this conversation going, and then Garry talked about waking up in the morning and preparing yourself to be misunderstood. And that's exactly where my head was, thinking, keeping this conversation going and preparing myself for the stress, and finding ways to be constructive to keep this conversation going because I'm often being misunderstood for anything that you put forward in my work and my leadership in the church. So those are the two things that's running through my head. However, I find this conversation has been so rich that it's giving me a lot of hope. And I know there's great people in this room and in the conversation, the people who have joined us today. So that is something hopeful for me, that there's hope that we can make some changes in the church. So thank you everyone for the contribution and for today. Thank you. So Chris and Garry, the floor is yours.
Two things. Gary's right, I think, when he says about the Uniting Church being theologically liberal. And I think part of the reason that the preamble got through was that people actually live in a liberal political kind of human rights framework. And they said, well, if that's what Aboriginal people want, then we should let them have it as a justice issue rather than a theological issue. So a lot of the theological nuance gets lost. So what you have is, I think, a church that's caught between that and the post-liberals and the kind of neo-Bartians who run a completely different kind of take on this conversation. But I think the preamble actually finds a way between those two options. I think it raises some really interesting, challenging theological conversations about genuine diversity and inclusion and dialogue, and I think one of the points of an ongoing conversation is not simply to keep rehashing the stuff that Garry and I are doing, but to actually raise the question: so what theologically is it opening up for second peoples in the life of the church? What can it say to a church that's committed to justice and inclusion and stuff? Is there a, rather than a political liberal theological foundation, is there actually a different theological foundation in here about the understanding of God? Potentially that would make a better foundation for the church's commitments to be itself. And the second thing I want to say is, I think one of the greatest things that a group can do at the moment in the Uniting Church is to offer some support to those people who are trying to do Indigenous theology. It takes money and support and encouragement and all sorts of things, and somehow we've got to get space for people to be able to do the work that they're trying to do.
Great, thanks, great. Garry.
Yeah, I agree with Chris. It's I think a lot of people who are members of the dominant culture don't really understand how hard it is to do this work. There's kind of this expectation that we'll do it as on our own time with our own money, in the middle of incredibly complex lives, and we'll be able to do it in a way that satisfies, the theological college kind of person as real theology, you know, and all of that. And it's just incredibly costly to do that. And, you know, it's speaking only for myself, you know, it's kind of broken me so many times. And I recognize that I've become super cautious to get engaged in conversation because of that. And super cautious about saying yes when a genuine opportunity comes my way, you know, because I've kind of become gun shy. So I just, you know, we do need to dialogue, and white people are always saying we do need to dialogue, but please, white people, recognize that it's not an equal conversation. We come to the conversation without the same resources that you do, both you know, intellectual resources, financial resources, and emotional resources. You know, we are traumatized people, and therefore it's not an equal conversation. It's not an equal playing field. And I think that if there is some recognition of that, then we can at least have another go. But I you know, I don't feel as hopeful as some other people about this, as you know. I just don't think the evidence is there to be as hopeful as some others would like to be. That's just the truth of the situation.
Thank you so much, Garry. It's now my task to mention that the webinar in November, next month, on the 28th, we are going back to focusing on Indigenous theologies with Dr. Anne Patel-Gray leading us in that conversation. So we will look forward to that, and it seemed to be a good, you know, connection from what Chris just said and from what you've just said, Garry. I mean, I guess, you know, to continue to hold a conversation on Indigenous theologies, you know, is all part of it. It links to this very difficult issue we've been talking about with the preamble. Yeah, so that's next month, and you know, we look forward to seeing as many of you there as possible. Thank you to Garry and Chris for giving us your time today. We hope that you will be open to joining us again in the future. Of course, Garry, you know, you're going to be someone that we will constantly call on, and I hope you don't mind. And then hopefully, Chris, you know, you'll be open to joining us again when we call on you. I'm now going to pass on to Liam to close with a prayer. Thank you very much, both you, Garry and Chris, and all of you who zoomed in.
Let's pray. Loving God, we thank you for this opportunity to have this conversation. We thank you for the wisdom and insight and experiences that have been shared. We thank you for those who worked on this preamble document and lament the treatment and pushback that was received. And pray for any wounds and broken trust that lingers because of that. We thank you that within the document we can be troubled and pushed. We thank you for the space and permission and fruitfulness for further conversations that it enabled. We lament how little has been done. We give thanks for that which has happened. Pray that we will be buoyed by the Spirit to be bolder in the call from it and from the covenant document and from many other conversations in our church, that we would be bolder in following and heeding and working for justice, in boldly resourcing more work in this area. Pray that we would heed what Garry said in terms of both seeking to enter into intimate and trustful relationships, but also knowing the cost it takes, and so entering with humility and with openness, and seeking to remove our own our own filters that seek to bring everything into something that fits. We thank you, Jesus Christ, that you go before us in all this, that you call to us, and that you remain with us. We can be bold, for you abide, and we abide in you. And so we pray for such boldness. Pray for Garry as he goes on with his work, and particularly he and Naomi as they continue to set up such a wonderful initiative with the University of Divinity. Pray for Chris in his ongoing studies and teaching, and pray for Catalina and Lotha and myself in our ministry context, and for Emma in her ongoing work. And pray for all those who have listened, that the words said today will linger and continue to provoke and challenge. In your holy name, amen.
Amen.